Mom, from now on, the cooking and laundry are all on you." I was sitting in the sunroom, sipping a cup of Earl Grey, enjoying the first morning of my retirement without having to rush off to work. Sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains, landing on my teacup and making the amber liquid glow. At 68 years old, after a 42-year career as a teacher, I thought I could finally take a breath. Suddenly, a greasy dish rag flew through the air and landed in my lap, staining my favorite beige cardigan. "Besides, you're retired now," my daughter-in-law, Melissa, announced, standing in the middle of the living room with her hands on her hips. Her chemically curled hair was pulled back into a high, tight ponytail. "You're just sitting around the house doing nothing anyway. You cannot just live here for free." I slowly set down my teacup, my fingers trembling slightly. The rag smelled of acrid grease, probably from just wiping down the kitchen stovetop. "Melissa, what kind of way is that to talk to my mom?" my son Ryan said as he walked out of the bedroom, his suit crisp and his tie perfectly knotted. A flicker of warmth sparked in my chest, but it was extinguished just as quickly when he continued, "Mom's getting older. You have to be a little more delicate." He walked over and stood before me, looking down at me with that familiar, impatient smile. "Mom, your Social Security check is only so much. And with the cost of living these days, Melissa and I are under a lot of pressure. It's only right that you help out with the chores around the house, don't you think?" I looked up at the son I had raised. When he had a fever as a child, I stayed up with him for 3 days and 3 nights straight. When he went to college, I scrimped and saved to buy him a laptop. When he got married, I gave him my entire life savings for the down payment on this house. And now he stood before me, his eyes as cold and indifferent as if he were looking at a stranger renting a room. "I understand," I said softly. I placed the dish rag on the table, stood up, and brushed off my cardigan. "You two go on to work. I'll take care of things here." Melissa let out a triumphant little hum and walked out, grabbing her purse on the way. Ryan hurried after her, but paused at the door to add, "Mom, remember to mop the floors too. Melissa likes things really clean." The sound of the door clicking shut echoed in the empty living room. I stood there, looking around the house I had lived in for 12 years, which was really just a small bedroom they had granted me. On the wall still hung a family portrait I'd brought with me. In the photo, Ryan was just an elementary school kid, his arms wrapped around my neck, grinning from ear to ear. I walked into the kitchen. The sink was piled high with dirty breakfast dishes. The stovetop was splattered with grease, and the trash can was overflowing. I rolled up my sleeves and started washing the dishes. As the water ran from the faucet, my tears started to fall, hot and silent. Before I retired, I'd always helped with cooking and cleaning after getting home from work. Even though Melissa constantly criticized my food for being too salty or too bland, or complained that I hadn't mopped the floors well enough, but I never imagined that on the very first day of my retirement. They would so blatantly treat me like an unpaid maid. After washing the dishes, I did not mop the floor. I went back to my small room and pulled a suitcase out from under the bed. It was an old suitcase, one my husband Henry and I had bought on a trip to Florida years ago. He's been gone for 8 years now. I wonder how much his heart would ache if he could see this. I slowly packed my things: clothes, photo albums, a few of my favorite books, the watch Henry had left me. I did not have much. It all fit into one suitcase. Finally, I took an envelope from under my pillow. Inside was the cash from my pension checks that I had been secretly setting aside for months. It was not a lot, but it was enough to get me settled somewhere for a little while. I left a note on the dining table. I'm going to find my own worth. Don't worry about me. Then I dragged my suitcase and walked out of that place they called home. At the entrance of the subdivision, I hailed a cab. "Where to, ma'am?" the driver asked cheerfully. I froze for a second. Where to? After Henry died, I sold our old house and moved in with my son. Now I had nowhere to go. "Just take me downtown," I said. Through the car window, familiar sights passed by: the elementary school where I had taught, the farmer's market I frequented, the old coffee shop Henry had loved. This city held the memories of most of my life, yet now I felt like a homeless wanderer. I checked into a hotel downtown. The room was small but clean. After setting down my suitcase, I sat by the window, watching the bustling crowds below. A sudden sense of relief washed over me. From a hidden compartment in my suitcase, I pulled out a large manila envelope. Inside was a collection of documents: property deeds, stock certificates, bank statements. Before Henry passed, he had held my hand and warned me to always have something for myself. Now, I finally understood his wisdom. I called my old friend Carolyn, and with her help, I made plans to move into my own condo. That night, as I lay in the hotel bed, I slept soundly for the first time in years. No chores, no orders, no humiliation, just peace. This place was more than twice the size of my small room at Ryan's house. It was filled with light, and it was all mine. "The rent has been deposited into your account on time every month," Carolyn said, pulling a folder from her briefcase. "After property taxes and management fees, you've been clearing about a certain amount a month. Here are the financial statements for the past several years." I took the folder, but did not open it. Carolyn was my husband's most trusted colleague, and now she was the only friend I could truly rely on. "There's no need. I trust you," I said, looking around. "I'm moving in today." "So soon?" Carolyn raised an eyebrow. "Aren't you going to wait for Ryan to come crawling back with an apology?" "He won't," I said with a bitter smile. "In his eyes, I'm just a stubborn old woman throwing a tantrum." Carolyn sighed and pulled out her phone. "All right, I'll call a moving company for you." "There's no need for that. It's just one suitcase," I said, shaking my head. nothing else matters. Carolyn drove me back to the hotel to get my luggage. On the way, she suddenly asked when I was going to tell Ryan the truth. "What truth?" I asked. "The truth that you have your own property and savings, that you don't need to depend on him," Carolyn said, tapping the steering wheel. "That boy probably thinks you're penniless, and that you'll come crawling back to him in a few days." I watched the streetlights blur past the window and did not answer. She was right. Ryan had probably never imagined that his compliant, hard-working mother actually had more than enough to live independently. Back at the hotel, I packed my single bag and checked out at the front desk. Just as I was about to leave, my phone rang again. This time, it was an unknown number. I answered hesitantly. It was Ryan's voice, thick with anger. He demanded to know why I hadn't been answering my calls, and whether I had any idea how worried Melissa and he had been. I told him calmly that I was fine, and that he didn't need to worry. He demanded to know where I was, and said he was coming to get me now, his tone sharp, like he was ordering around a disobedient child. I told him that wasn't necessary and glanced at Carolyn beside me. I said I was staying with a friend for a few days. He immediately questioned what friend I could possibly have in the city, his voice full of suspicion, and told me to stop the nonsense and come home. He added that Melissa said if I came back, I could do less housework. I closed my eyes, feeling a tightness in my chest. In his mind, did I not even have the right to have friends of my own? I interrupted him and reminded him that I was 68 years old and had a right to my own life. I told him that he and Melissa should take care of themselves. He tried to interrupt again, but I hung up and turned off my phone. Carolyn looked at me with concern and asked if I was okay. I said I was fine and managed a weak smile. I told her it was time to go home. The word home coming from my own lips felt strangely foreign. For decades, my home had always shifted according to the needs of my husband and son, from a school dormitory to company-provided housing, and finally to that small room in Ryan's house. And now, at last, I had a space that was entirely my own. The property manager at Sunnyvale Gardens was a pleasant, middle-aged man. When he learned I was the owner, he warmly helped me with the move-in paperwork. Carolyn helped me buy groceries and daily necessities, staying until evening. Before she left, she told me to call her anytime and not to go soft on Ryan, insisting that he needed to learn a lesson. After she left, I stood in the empty living room, a feeling of unreality washing over me. Yesterday at this time, I was washing dishes in Ryan's kitchen. Now, I had a fresh start. I opened my suitcase and hung my few items of clothing in the closet. At the bottom was an old photo album filled with pictures of Ryan from childhood to adulthood. I gently caressed the yellowed photos as memories flooded back his first steps, his first day of school, his college graduation. Back then, his eyes had still been filled with love and gratitude for his mother. The last page of the album held a family portrait taken a month before Henry died. He was painfully thin in the photo, but insisted on standing, one arm around my shoulder and the other around Ryan. He looked directly at the camera as if to say, "Take care of yourself, Margaret." I carefully took the photo out and placed it on the nightstand. Then, from the hidden compartment of my suitcase, I took out the manila envelope and spread the documents on the bed. The property deed clearly had my name on it, dated months after Henry's passing. There were 3 mutual fund contracts totaling a large sum, with steady monthly returns, and a commercial lease agreement with a solid annual rent. Combined with my pension, my fixed monthly income was close to a comfortable amount, more than 3 times what Ryan thought I had. I let out a long breath and locked the documents in the desk drawer in the office. Henry was right. You always have to have a safety net. That night, I cooked a simple bowl of soup for myself and sat by the sliding glass door to eat. The city lights began to sparkle, and the traffic flowed like a river of light. My phone remained off. I did not want Ryan's calls to disturb this rare moment of peace. After a shower, I lay down in the unfamiliar but comfortable bed, tossing and turning. My mind was filled with images of Ryan as a child. The nights I stayed up with him when he had a fever. The evenings I helped him study for exams. The money I saved from my own expenses each month when he was in college. Suddenly, my phone vibrated. I had forgotten to turn it off completely. A text from Ryan appeared saying that Melissa was pregnant and asking whether I was really going to let my grandchild be born without a grandmother. My fingers trembled slightly. Pregnant. What a coincidence. The day after I left, I did not reply. Instead, I called Carolyn and asked her to check on something for me. The next morning, sunlight streamed into the bedroom. I made myself coffee and toast and sat on the balcony, watching elderly neighbors exercise and younger residents walk their dogs. A long-forgotten sense of freedom washed over me. My phone had 3 unread messages from Ryan, insisting Melissa was really pregnant. He even sent a blurry ultrasound image dated the very day I had left. I took a sip of coffee, my mind clearing. If Melissa were truly pregnant, why had she been screaming and throwing a dish rag at me the day before? The doorbell rang. Carolyn stood outside with breakfast. She told me Melissa was not pregnant at all, just an irregular period. The truth sent a chill through my heart. They had fabricated a pregnancy just to lure me back. Then Carolyn said there was more. She had made an appointment with a lawyer to review Henry's estate. A knot formed in my stomach. Later that day, flowers arrived from Ryan and Melissa, with an apology clearly written only by Ryan. I left them untouched. At a coffee shop, I overheard young women complaining about their mother-in-laws. I realized that, in their eyes, I was probably that woman. Then a message came from Ethan, Ryan's colleague, saying Ryan hadn't gone to work and was looking for me. I turned my phone on and saw dozens of messages. One message made my heart skip a beat. Ryan had called the police. My heart skipped a beat, though I knew it was just a threat. If this really escalated to involving the authorities, it would be bad for everyone. I dialed Ryan's number. He answered instantly, his voice on the verge of tears, asking where I was and saying he had been looking for me all day. I calmly told him I was fine and staying at a friend's house. He immediately demanded to know which friend and insisted on getting the address so he could come get me. I told him that wasn't necessary and that I needed some time to myself. His voice suddenly rose as he accused me of being scammed by someone, saying my pension was so small and questioning how I could afford to stay anywhere. He blamed Carolyn, claiming she had never liked him and must have put me up to this. I closed my eyes as the tightness returned to my chest. In his mind, I was just a clueless old woman with no judgment, liable to be tricked out of my meager pension at any moment. I told him calmly that I was 68 years old and fully capable of deciding where I went, and that he and Melissa should take care of themselves. He began shouting, saying I couldn't do this, that he was my son and my only family, and asking how I could abandon him. I laughed bitterly and told him that he and Melissa were the ones who had started treating me like a maid. There was silence on the other end for several seconds. Then Melissa's sharp voice came through, apologizing and claiming she was young and foolish, asking me not to hold it against her and begging me to come back, saying she and Ryan couldn't live without me. Her sudden humility stunned me. Melissa had always been arrogant, and I had never heard her speak like this. I softly asked whether she was really pregnant. She eagerly insisted it was true, saying she had been excited after the checkup the day before and hadn't been thinking straight. She repeated that I was going to be a grandmother and pleaded with me to come home. I gripped the phone, remembering the real diagnosis Carolyn had uncovered. They were still lying. I told them I needed time to think, then hung up and turned off my phone again. That afternoon, I arrived at the law firm Carolyn had recommended. The lawyer who met me, Mr. Thompson, was in his 50s, wearing gold-rimmed glasses and speaking in a calm, deliberate manner. He adjusted his glasses and told me that regarding the estate of my late husband, Henry, there were some details I needed to be aware of. He took a document from a file and explained that Henry had established a trust fund before his passing. The beneficiaries were me and my son Ryan, but there was a special clause stating that if Ryan was found to be unfilial or neglectful toward me, I had the right to revoke his beneficiary status. I took the document, stunned. A trust fund. Henry had never mentioned it. I asked how much money was in the fund, my voice trembling. Mr. Thompson said its current value was approximately a very large amount, and that it generated a significant monthly income deposited directly into my account. He added that strangely, it appeared I had never touched this money in the past several years. I felt as though I had been struck by lightning. I had never received a single penny. I scanned the document again and suddenly noticed the receiving account number. It was not my bank account. Mr. Thompson leaned in and confirmed that I was right. The account was a temporary one designated by Henry and was supposed to have been transferred to my name years ago. My fingers began to shake. After Henry died, Ryan had handled all the financial paperwork, insisting he wanted to help me with complicated matters. I had trusted him completely and given him power of attorney. My voice came out hoarse as I asked Mr. Thompson to check who currently held that account. After I signed the authorization form, he made a call to the bank. Minutes later, he returned with the answer. The current user of the account was Ryan. I collapsed into the chair as the world darkened around me. Ryan had been secretly pocketing the trust fund Henry left for me, all while letting me believe we were struggling and forcing me to rely on his charity. Mr. Thompson asked if I was all right. I took a deep breath and told him I wanted to sue Ryan and get the money back. He looked uncomfortable and suggested mediation first, calling it a family matter. I laughed coldly and said there was nothing to mediate when a son stole his own mother's retirement money. When I left the law firm, the sunlight stung my eyes. For years, Ryan had been quietly taking a large monthly sum while I lived on my small pension and worked as his unpaid maid. I called Carolyn, my voice shaking, and told her everything. When she burst into my condo, I was sitting on the balcony, staring into space. The trust fund, Ryan's years of deceit, and Melissa's fake pregnancy swirled in my mind, making it hard to breathe. Carolyn pulled me into a hug and told me not to be scared. Her light perfume reminded me of the day Henry died, when she had held me the same way and promised to take care of me. Who could have imagined the deepest wound would come from the son I trusted most? She carefully reviewed the documents, her expression growing darker, and said Ryan looked innocent but was deeply corrupt. He had taken a large sum without giving me a single cent. I bitterly added that he had made me believe the family was broke, so I would depend on him to survive. Carolyn abruptly stood and insisted we go to the bank immediately to track where the money went. Together, we went to the bank managing the trust. After reviewing the transaction history, the manager showed us that for years, on the same day each month, the same amount had been withdrawn using Ryan's signature under the power of attorney I had granted him. I trembled, explaining I had signed those documents shortly after Henry's death to simplify the estate, never imagining Ryan would use them to steal from me. Carolyn asked whether the account could be frozen, but the manager said a court order would be required. After leaving the bank, Carolyn contacted a judge she knew, who advised sending a formal legal demand first. Carolyn was furious and said someone like Ryan should be arrested Immediately, I took her hand and told her I wanted to talk to him first. She protested, saying he had lied for years, but I insisted I wanted to hear what he had to say. After all, he was the son I had raised. Reluctantly, she agreed. Back home, I turned on my phone and sent Ryan a message telling him to meet me the next morning at the entrance of Sunnyvale Gardens and to come alone. He replied instantly, shocked that I lived there and commenting on how expensive it was. I told him not to tell Melissa and turned my phone off. That night, I barely slept. Memories of Ryan as a child clashed violently with the reality of his betrayal. The next morning, I made strong tea and waited on the balcony. When I went downstairs, Ryan was already there, wearing the dark blue shirt I had bought him the previous year. His eyes lit up when he saw me, and he hurried over, commenting on how expensive the place was and asking where I got the money for rent. I calmly told him I wasn't renting and that the condo was mine. His eyes widened in disbelief. I told him I had bought it years ago with Henry's life insurance, right after Ryan had helped me manage the trust fund. His face drained of color. I used his full name as I confronted him about the money Henry had left for me and the monthly withdrawals he had taken while I struggled. His face shifted from white to red, and then pale again as he begged me to let him explain. I demanded an explanation for how he could watch me struggle while secretly stealing from me. He blamed Melissa, claiming she had pressured him to invest the money for their future. I pulled my hand away and stared coldly at him, seeing a grown man who blamed others the moment he was caught. I demanded he return the money. He stammered that he didn't have it all anymore, and that most of it had been invested. When I asked where, he admitted it was in one of Melissa's cousin's projects, with an unrealistically high return. I felt sick. It was clearly a scam, and the money was likely gone. I gave him 1 week to return the money or face court. He panicked and asked if I would really send my own son to jail. I coldly asked whether he had thought about jail while stealing from me. He suddenly shouted that the money was his anyway, claiming Henry left it for him. I stepped back in disbelief. I told him the trust document was clear, and that he only inherited if he treated me well. As of now, he would receive nothing. I turned and walked away as he shouted threats behind me. I entered my building without looking back. The security guard asked if everything was all right, and I forced a weak smile and told him not to let that man in again. Back in my apartment, I collapsed onto the sofa and finally cried. Carolyn had been right. Some people were not worth forgiving. The phone rang. It was Mr. Thompson. His voice was serious as he told me he had uncovered new information. He said Henry's trust originally stipulated that Ryan could only inherit a small percentage, and only if he met 3 specific conditions. First, with your consent. Second, after he was married and financially stable. And third, if he was a filial son to you. And now, years ago, Ryan altered the documents, changing his share to a much larger percentage and forging your signature. Mr. Thompson paused. That constitutes a felony. I gripped the phone, a heavy weight pressing on my chest. Ryan not only stole the money, but he also forged documents. My son, when did he become this person? Mr. Thompson, I took a deep breath. I've made my decision. We're filing the lawsuit. After hanging up, I stood by the window, watching the children playing in the garden below. Once upon a time, Ryan was that innocent. What changed him? Was it Melissa's influence, the lure of money, or was it my own overly doting upbringing? My phone rang again. It was Melissa. I hesitated, then answered. She sobbed, begging me not to do this to Ryan, reminding me he was my only son, and asking how I could bear to see him go to prison. I calmly asked her whether, when they were lying to me, they had ever thought about this day. She choked out an apology, saying they were wrong and truly knew it now. She claimed the money had been invested and couldn't be retrieved immediately, but they could sign an IOU and repay me once they made a profit. I asked her to explain the investment clearly. She stammered that it was her cousin's medical project with an extremely high annual return. I scoffed, reminding her she was a college-educated woman, and asking how she could believe in such an obvious scam. There was a pause, and then her tone changed. The crying stopped, replaced by a cold threat. She said if the case went to court, they would claim the money was a gift from me, and that no one would believe an old woman like me. I was shaking with rage. I told her I had all the documents and bank statements. She sneered and said it was a family dispute, and the most a judge would do was order mediation. Then she asked who would take care of me when I got sick and old, implying I would end up in a nursing home. I hung up and turned off my phone, one playing the victim, the other issuing threats. A perfect pair. That evening, Carolyn came over with ingredients for lasagna. When I told her what had happened, she was so furious she nearly dropped the dish. She called Melissa despicable and said we were going to the courthouse the next day. She promised to pull some strings to get the case seen quickly. As I stirred the sauce, I admitted I was wondering whether I should give them one more chance. Carolyn stared at me in disbelief and reminded me they had stolen a huge sum of money and threatened me. My voice cracked as I said Ryan was still my son, remembering how good he had been as a child. Carolyn grabbed my shoulders and told me to wake up. She said the good little boy I remembered was gone, and the man who remained was a monster. Tears dripped into the pot as I lowered my head. She was right. The son I loved no longer existed. The Ryan of today had nothing in his eyes but greed and no trace of decency. I wiped my tears and told her that tomorrow we would go to the courthouse. The courthouse hallways were cold and long. I sat on a bench with Carolyn and Mr. Thompson beside me as we submitted the official complaint against Ryan, demanding the return of the entire trust fund plus years of interest. Carolyn squeezed my cold hand and asked if I was nervous. I shook my head, though my eyes kept drifting toward the entrance. I had notified Ryan of the proceedings. At the appointed time, Ryan and Melissa rushed in. Ryan wore a suit, as if attending a business meeting. Melissa wore a loose-fitting dress, her abdomen slightly rounded, and this time it seemed she might truly be pregnant. Ryan approached me with a forced smile, suggesting we talk at home instead of making a scene. Nausea washed over me. This was the son I once would have given my life for, now standing before me like a calculating stranger. Mr. Thompson stepped between us and formally informed Ryan that we were suing him for misappropriation of trust assets, handing him the complaint. Ryan's face darkened instantly. He accused me of cruelty. I calmly replied that he had been cruel first. He suddenly raised his voice, drawing attention, shouting that his own mother was suing him and trying to destroy him while his wife was pregnant. Melissa clutched her stomach and cried, asking how I could do this to my grandchild. I stood up and looked them straight in the eyes. I reminded Melissa that just the day before she had claimed the money was a gift, yet now accused me of ruining them. Her tears stopped instantly. I turned to Ryan and gave him one final chance to admit his wrongdoing and return the money in exchange for dropping the lawsuit. He clenched his teeth and said the money was invested and unavailable. He warned me not to blame him for becoming heartless. Carolyn demanded to know what he intended to do. Ryan sneered and pulled out a stack of papers detailing supposed expenses for my rent, utilities, and food during the years I lived with them, totaling a large sum. My hands shook as I held the papers. Carolyn trembled with rage, reminding him I had worked tirelessly in his home. Ryan claimed I did it voluntarily and accused me of counting pennies with my own son. I looked at him, remembering the boy who once told me I was the most important person in his world. My heart shattered. I took a deep breath and agreed to settle everything. I calmly calculated the market value of my labor as a cook, cleaner, and laundress over the years, listing exact figures and totals. I told him that after subtracting his claimed expenses, he still owed me a significant amount, which, added to the stolen trust fund, resulted in a massive total he needed to repay. Ryan's face turned red with fury, accusing me of extortion. Mr. Thompson coolly stated that my calculations were reasonable market rates. Suddenly, Ryan dropped to his knees, begging forgiveness and claiming the money was gone. He asked if I would really watch my son go bankrupt. I felt nothing. Even now, he was still lying. A court clerk appeared and summoned us for mediation. The judge, a kind-looking middle-aged woman, reviewed the documents and sighed, saying family disputes were best resolved through negotiation. She asked whether I truly wanted to sue my own son. I explained that I did not want this, but that Ryan had first stolen the retirement money my late husband left for me. Ryan tried to interrupt, but the judge silenced him and stated plainly that altering a trust and forging a signature were criminal offenses that could lead to prison. Melissa panicked and said they were willing to repay the money in installments. I immediately agreed on the condition that they sign a repayment agreement and use their house as collateral. Ryan objected, calling it their marital home. I stood up to leave, saying we would proceed to court. Melissa grabbed my arm and agreed, insisting they could buy another house, but could not survive if Ryan went to jail. Under the judge's supervision, Ryan signed the agreement, admitting to misappropriating the trust fund and promising to repay it within several years, using their property as collateral. If he defaulted, I would have the right to force the sale of the house. Outside the courthouse, Ryan asked whether I was satisfied. I told him I would only be satisfied if my son were an honest man. He sneered and accused me of pretending to be helpless while secretly owning the condo. I shook my head and told him some people never admit their faults. Back home, I collapsed onto the sofa, exhausted. Though I had won legally, my heart felt empty. Using the law against my own son was not a victory to celebrate. That evening, Carolyn brought good news. She told me the community college's lifelong learning program wanted me to teach a calligraphy class. I smiled weakly and said I wasn't in the mood. She reminded me that starting today, I was beginning a new life. A new life. At my age, perhaps life was just beginning. I no longer had to be anyone's maid or walk on eggshells. I could finally live for myself. The next morning, I woke early, made a cup of tea, and sat on the balcony practicing calligraphy. Sunlight spilled onto the paper, and the brush moved with steady, confident strokes. My phone rang. It was an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. The man on the other end asked if I was Margaret Vance and introduced himself as Andrew Collins, the principal at Oakwood Elementary. He said he had heard I'd retired and wanted to invite me to mentor some of their young teachers. Oakwood Elementary was the last school where I had taught. After hanging up, I looked out at the sunshine, a smile slowly forming on my lips. Life, it seemed, was kind to those who were brave enough to start over. The gates of Oakwood Elementary were just as I remembered. I stood at the entrance, watching the children run and play, feeling as though I had stepped into another world. I had only been retired for a few weeks, but it felt like a lifetime. Mrs. Vance, Principal Collins called, walking over to greet me. He said he was glad I could come. I smiled and shook his hand. He was about 10 years younger than me. I had recommended him for the vice principal position before I retired, and now he was in charge. He commented that I looked wonderful and asked how I was adjusting to retired life. I told him it had been fine, glossing over the turmoil of the past weeks, and reminded him that he had mentioned needing me to mentor some young teachers. He explained that the newer teachers in the English department lacked experience and struggled with classroom management. He hoped I could come once a week, observe classes, and offer advice. 7 or 8 young teachers were seated in the conference room. They all stood to greet me when I entered. I recognized a few as former student teachers I had once mentored. One young woman with a ponytail excitedly said how good it was to have me back and admitted they were at their wits' end. I couldn't help but smile. It felt good to be needed again. After the meeting, Principal Collins pulled me aside and mentioned a special class he hoped I would consider taking on, the 6th grade honors class. It had been my class before I retired. They had gone through 3 teachers since, and none had managed to handle it. The 6th grade honors class was notoriously difficult. I had only just gotten them under control before leaving. I told him I needed time to think. I had only just found my own rhythm and didn't want to commit too quickly. As I was leaving the school, I ran into a former colleague, Laura Bennett. Her eyes widened when she saw me. She said Ryan had told everyone I'd moved out of state to live with relatives. I smiled tiredly and explained I had simply moved out on my own. She looked me up and down in disbelief and asked where I was living. I explained briefly that I had bought a place years ago, rented it out, and had taken it back for myself. Laura looked stunned and said Ryan had been telling everyone I was destitute and homeless. He had even organized teachers to go looking for me. My heart sank. What was Ryan trying to do now? When I got home, I turned on my phone, which I had kept off for peace. Dozens of missed calls and messages flooded in, mostly from Ryan and his colleagues, all saying he was worried and claiming I might have been scammed. One message said he had called the police. The latest message from Ryan said he had found out I owned a condo at Sunnyvale Gardens and accused me of hiding it from him. I scoffed and didn't reply. It was my property. The doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Carolyn holding several grocery bags. She announced she'd brought my favorites and came in. I helped her set the table and told her about my visit to the school. When she heard Ryan was telling people I was homeless, she slammed her hand on the table, furious, calling him ungrateful. I told her to forget it and not talk about him. She asked about the community college, excitedly telling me classes would start next Monday. 2 calligraphy classes a week filled with retired professionals and teachers. As we talked, the doorbell rang again. This time it was the building manager saying a Mr. Vance claiming to be my son was downstairs and insisting on coming up. Carolyn and I exchanged a look. Ryan had found me. I told them to let him up. I had to face him sooner or later. Minutes later, Ryan stood at my door, panting. His suit was wrinkled, his hair a mess, his eyes bloodshot. He glared at Carolyn and accused her of convincing me to move out. I raised a hand to stop her from responding and told Ryan to say what he came to say. He suddenly dropped to his knees, crying and apologizing, promising to pay the money back and begging me to come home. I watched his exaggerated performance with a heart as still as water. He had done the same at the courthouse, apologizing only to turn on me later. I told him calmly that the money would be handled according to the legal agreement, and that this was my home. He looked around the apartment greedily and asked when I bought it and why I hadn't told him. Carolyn sneered that it was so he wouldn't find a way to steal this too. Ryan snapped at her to stay out of family business. I slammed my hand on the table and told Ryan he was not welcome and needed to leave. He stared at me in disbelief, accusing me of choosing an outsider over my own son. I told him Carolyn was not an outsider and that he had disappointed me beyond words. His face twisted with rage as he stormed out, slamming the door. The echo made my heart tremble. Carolyn told me not to listen to him, but I shook my head, fighting tears. No matter what, he was still the child I had raised. The next morning, Principal Collins called and told me Ryan had gone to the school, caused a scene, and claimed I was mentally unstable, demanding they not hire me. I felt as though I'd been struck by lightning. Principal Collins assured me they knew my character, but said it would be safer for me to stay away for a while. After hanging up, a chill spread through me. Ryan was trying to cut off all my paths. Carolyn rushed over and angrily suggested suing him for defamation. I stopped her, a thought suddenly forming. I said Ryan was afraid of more than my financial independence. He was afraid I would uncover something. I immediately called Laura and asked what Ryan had been saying at school and whether he'd been acting strangely. Afterward, I pulled out a small box of Henry's belongings. Inside were items I'd never examined closely. As I opened it, Carolyn asked what I was looking for. I told her I didn't know, only that I had a feeling. Inside were Henry's fountain pen, pocket watch, a few coins, and an old photograph. It showed a young Henry holding a baby in front of an unfamiliar house. On the back was written, Ethan's first birthday. Ryan was born years later. My hands began to shake. I asked Carolyn if Henry had been married before he met me. Her expression changed, and she admitted he had a brief marriage in college. The woman gave birth and left. Henry raised the child alone until he was 3, then met me. The child didn't remember anything, so Henry made everyone promise to keep it secret. I collapsed onto the sofa as decades of memories rushed through me. The phone rang. It was Laura, telling me Ryan had been searching old school records, specifically Henry's personnel files from years ago. A jolt went through me. Did Ryan already know the truth? The next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains. I stared at the photograph on my nightstand, Henry, holding the infant named Ethan. That child had grown up to be Ryan. My phone buzzed with missed calls and a message from Laura saying she had discovered something important. When I called her back, she urgently told me Ryan had been in contact with a woman named Vanessa Moore, believed to be his biological mother. My fingers went numb. Laura added that Ryan had been searching for records related to a loan project Henry once managed that seemed connected to this woman. After hanging up, I immediately found the number of Henry's former assistant, Mr. Grant, and after exchanging pleasantries, I got straight to the point. Mr. Grant, I need to look into a loan project Henry handled around several years ago. It might be connected to a woman named Vanessa Moore. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Mrs. Vance, why are you asking about this now? Someone else has been looking into it. I told him I needed to know the truth. Mr. Grant sighed heavily and explained that Vanessa had been Henry's ex-wife. Years ago, she had returned with a child, claiming her business had failed and that she was deeply in debt to loan sharks. Henry had a soft heart and broke regulations to approve a loan for her. The issue was later discovered, and he had nearly lost his job because of it. My heart pounded as Mr. Grant continued. Vanessa had taken the money and disappeared, leaving the loan unpaid. It became a bad debt, and Henry repaid most of it himself, with the rest eventually written off by the bank. Mr. Grant paused and said this was something Henry had always felt deeply guilty about. He believed he had wronged me. After hanging up, I sat by the window, my thoughts in chaos. Henry had never told me any of this. Was it because he feared my anger, or because he could never truly let go of his past? The doorbell rang, and it was Carolyn holding a thick file folder. She said she had gathered information on Vanessa Moore. Inside was a background report stating that Vanessa, now in her late 40s, was the CFO of an investment firm, divorced, no children. I froze. No children. Then, who was Ryan? Carolyn pointed to a line stating that Vanessa had married Henry years ago and divorced him shortly after. During the marriage, they had adopted a boy named Ryan Vance, and custody had been awarded to Henry after the divorce. Adopted. Ryan wasn't Vanessa's biological son either. Then, who were his real parents? My voice trembled as I asked Carolyn to help me find the truth about Ryan's birth. That afternoon, I went to the community college for my first calligraphy class as planned. The classroom was filled with silver-haired students, lively and attentive. They applauded warmly as I entered. I greeted them and began teaching the basic strokes of standard script. The 3-hour class passed quickly, and afterward, the students surrounded me with questions and proudly showed me their work. The respect and appreciation allowed me to temporarily forget the shocking revelations of the morning. After class, the dean approached me and asked whether I would be interested in teaching a classical literature appreciation course as well. I accepted gladly. My retirement was becoming fuller than I had ever imagined. When I returned home, Carolyn was waiting for me, her expression grim. She told me she had found the truth. Ryan had been adopted from the city orphanage and his biological parents were unknown. I released a long breath, unsure whether I felt relief or disappointment. At least, he was not Henry's biological child with his ex-wife. But Carolyn lowered her voice and added that Vanessa had been contacting Ryan frequently, and that it appeared they were planning something. Just then, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. A cold, arrogant female voice asked if I was Margaret Vance. She introduced herself as Vanessa Moore, Ryan's mother, and said we needed to talk. I asked what about, and she replied that it concerned the inheritance her son deserved. She claimed Henry had left behind more than just a small trust fund. Carolyn was frantically gesturing for me to hang up, but on impulse, I agreed to meet. She named a time and place, a coffee shop at the Grand Hotel, and warned me not to bring Carolyn or the deal was off. After hanging up, Carolyn panicked, insisting it was an obvious trap. I told her calmly that I needed to know what Vanessa wanted. The next morning, I went to the Grand Hotel alone. In a corner of the cafe, a well-dressed, middle-aged woman waved me over. It was Vanessa. She was impeccably groomed, with sharp features and eyes that resembled Ryan's. She greeted me with a false smile and said she had heard much about me. I asked directly what Henry had left behind. She delayed, instead asking whether I knew why Ryan had been so cruel to me. My heart tightened as she claimed Ryan had known since childhood that he was not my biological son. She mocked Henry for pretending to treat him equally while guarding against him, and accused me of only caring for a biological child of my own. I was stunned. I told her I had never had another child. She raised an eyebrow and claimed Henry had told her I gave away a daughter early in my marriage. My hands trembled. It was absurd. I demanded to know what she wanted. She produced a document showing Henry's illegal loan approval from years ago, threatening to ruin his reputation, even in death. She demanded I give up my claim to the trust fund in exchange for her silence. I examined the document. It bore Henry's signature and an official seal dated before our marriage. I told her calmly that this did not threaten me. Henry had been gone for years, and the court had already ruled on the money. Her expression darkened, and she warned me I would regret it. When I left the hotel, sunlight hit my face, but I felt chilled. Vanessa's appearance explained Ryan's hatred and obsession with money, but the lie about a daughter disturbed me deeply. When I returned home, Ryan was waiting at my door, dressed in a suit and holding a folder. He said we needed to talk. I kept my distance and told him to speak there. He laughed coldly and said Henry had been distant because he had a dark secret. He accused Henry of embezzlement related to a fraudulent loan. I told him calmly that I already knew the truth, that the loan was for Vanessa, and that Henry had paid it back himself. Ryan's face twisted as he shouted that Henry never loved him and had been guarding an inheritance meant for a real daughter. I told him firmly that was a lie. Henry and I never had any other children. Ryan sneered and produced a birth certificate. The name read Clara Vance, female, born years ago, listing Henry and Margaret as parents. My hands shook violently. The document looked real, but it was impossible. I told him it was a forgery. Ryan began crying hysterically, insisting he had searched for years, and that Henry had left everything for this supposed daughter, while he was only an adopted son. I stared at him, my heart breaking, realizing just how deeply poisoned his mind had become. The child I had raised for over 25 years had been completely blinded by such a ridiculous lie. "Ryan," I said, fighting back tears, "look at me. In all these years, have I ever mistreated you in any way? When you were sick, who stayed up all night? When you started school, who drove you back and forth, rain or shine? When you got married, who gave you their life savings?" He hesitated for a moment, but his expression quickly hardened again. He said that was only because I hadn't known Clara existed, and asked if I would still have been so good to him if I had known. I shook my head, too weary to argue anymore. Some people would rather believe a carefully crafted lie than face a painful truth. His tone suddenly softened. He said that if I dropped my claim to the trust fund, he was willing to continue being my son. I looked him straight in the eye and asked what would happen if I refused. He threatened to expose Henry's scandal and the existence of Clara to everyone, to tell the world how I had mistreated my adopted son. Looking at his twisted face, I suddenly felt a sense of release. The child I once loved with all my heart now stood before me like a cruel stranger. I calmly told him to expose whatever he wanted, and that I would not give up a single cent. He snarled, called my name, and warned that I would be ruined before slamming the door and leaving. I leaned against the wall, my legs weak. The forged birth certificate slipped from my hand and fluttered to the floor when Carolyn rushed over. I was still sitting in the living room in a daze, clutching that absurd piece of paper. She fumed that this was insane and said she had known Henry and me forever and would have known if we had a daughter. She insisted on calling a lawyer immediately to sue them for defamation. I laughed bitterly and said it was useless to reason with crazy people. Carolyn firmly replied that forging a public document was a crime and that she would find out who Clara was and why she was pretending to be my daughter. The next day, Carolyn brought shocking news. She had found a woman named Clara Vance living in the city, 32 years old, single, and working for a multinational corporation. Even stranger, her official records showed she was adopted. The names of the adoptive parents listed were Henry Vance and Margaret Vance. I trembled and said this was impossible, that I had never adopted a child. Carolyn said someone had clearly falsified the records and warned that this was serious. She said someone was pulling the strings behind Vanessa and Ryan. I suddenly remembered Henry's words on his deathbed when he told me never to put all my eggs in one basket and that people change. At the time, I thought he was just being paranoid. Now I wondered if he had known something all along. I asked Carolyn, my voice shaking, to look into Henry's whereabouts in the months before he died, and whether he had met Vanessa during that time. That afternoon, I went to the community college as scheduled. The moment I walked into the classroom, I sensed something was wrong. The students were gathered in small groups, whispering. When they noticed me, they fell silent and stared strangely. I asked the class representative what was wrong. He hesitated and told me that someone had been handing out flyers at the school entrance, claiming that my husband and I had abused our adopted son and favored our biological daughter. He handed me a flyer. On it was a photograph of Henry and me with a sensational headline exposing the so-called true face of the hypocritical teacher, Margaret Vance. The content was filled with lies fabricated by Ryan and Vanessa, and it even included a copy of the forged birth certificate. My hands trembled uncontrollably, and my vision blurred. Ryan had actually done this for money. He was willing to publicly humiliate the woman who raised him. The representative said none of the students believed it and asked if they should call the police. I thanked him and said I would handle it. I taught the class, but my mind was elsewhere. When I returned home, I found the same flyers plastered all over my front door. The property manager hurried over and said a man had just been posting them and cursing when asked to leave. I asked what he looked like, and the description matched Ryan. He had come here himself to spread these lies about me. Just as I was about to go inside, my phone rang. It was Principal Collins. He said someone had posted these rumors on the school's official website and social media, causing serious trouble, and that the school board had decided to suspend my mentorship role until things were cleared up. I felt as though I had fallen into an icy abyss. Ryan and Vanessa were trying to destroy my reputation and my life. When Carolyn arrived, I was sitting on the sofa surrounded by the malicious flyers. She hugged me and said not to be afraid, that she had already contacted a lawyer, and that this was clear-cut slander. I asked her to help me find Clara. I needed to know why she was going along with this lie. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made me jump. At 3 a.m, my phone vibrated. It was a text from an unknown number. The message said it was Clara, and that she was sorry and had been used, asking if we could meet and talk. I stared at the message, my heart pounding. This daughter I had never known, who was she really? In the morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains. I picked up my phone and saw the message was still there. After much hesitation, I replied, asking when and where. She quickly responded, suggesting noon at the 3rd floor reading room of the city's main library, and asking me to come alone. Carolyn strongly objected, saying it was obviously a trap. I told her I had to find out why Clara was pretending to be my daughter. Carolyn insisted she would follow me secretly, and told me to call the police if there was any trouble. At noon, I arrived at the library alone. The reading room was quiet and spacious, with only a few people scattered around. I sat by the window, my heart racing. A soft voice called my name from behind. I turned to see a woman in her early 30s, dressed simply, with an oddly familiar face. She introduced herself as Clara and apologized for the trouble she had caused. I motioned for her to sit and studied her face. She did resemble Henry more than me. I asked her directly who she really was. She said quietly that she was Henry Vance's daughter, but not mine. I felt as if I had been struck by lightning. She explained that her mother was Vanessa Moore, and that she had been born years after Henry and Vanessa divorced. She handed me a DNA test report, confirming with overwhelming certainty that she was Henry's biological daughter. My vision blurred as I took the report. Henry had betrayed me. He had been with his ex-wife after we were married. Clara urgently explained that Vanessa had used her, forging my name on documents and making her believe I had abandoned her. It wasn't until she saw the flyers that she realized the truth, that I had never known she existed. She said Henry had raised her in secret until his death. I felt as though I were sinking into icy water. All the late nights and business trips suddenly made sense. I asked her how old she was, my voice hoarse. She told me her birth date, and I quickly calculated the years. That was when Henry had often worked late. Clara suddenly knelt before me and apologized, saying her mother had lied and turned her against me. She said she had hated me for years, only to realize we were both victims. I told her to get up and asked why Vanessa had done all this. Clara said bitterly that her mother's business had failed and she was deeply in debt, and that she had wanted to use Ryan's status as an adopted son to get the trust fund. I froze when Clara clarified that Ryan was not Vanessa's biological child either. She explained that Ryan had been adopted by Henry and Vanessa before their divorce, and that Henry had taken custody. Clara then handed me a USB drive, saying it contained evidence that Vanessa and Ryan had forged adoption records to obtain the trust fund, and that Ryan had been investigating a loan project Henry handled involving a large sum of missing money. I took the drive, my fingers trembling. This was far more complicated than I had imagined. I asked why she was telling me all this. Clara said she no longer wanted to be used by her mother, and that I was the one her father truly loved. Before he died, Henry told me his biggest regret in life was hurting me. A sharp pain pierced my chest. Henry had been thinking of me at the end. I asked Clara when he told her this. She said softly that it was the week before he passed. He had a high fever and was delirious, repeatedly calling my name and saying he was sorry about Clara. My tears finally broke free. The Clara Henry had mentioned, I had always thought he was rambling, but he was saying her name. I suddenly asked where he was buried. Clara told me Hillcrest Cemetery, East Section, Row 4, Plot 17, and said she visited him every week. Hillcrest Cemetery was not where Henry and I had planned to be buried. We had chosen plots together at Pine Ridge Memorial Park on the west side of the city, where we loved watching the sunset. Clara cautiously asked whether I could forgive her father. I didn't answer. More than 40 years of marriage built on such a lie. How could forgiveness come easily? Back home, I plugged the USB drive into my computer. The files were staggering. Not only were there forged documents created by Vanessa and Ryan, but also internal files from the loan project Henry had managed. The amount was $20 million. The borrower was a shell corporation, but the real beneficiary was Vanessa. Even more shocking was that the money later vanished. The bank's investigation had gone nowhere, and the debt was eventually written off. Henry had been suspected of involvement and nearly indicted, but the case was dropped due to insufficient evidence. I collapsed into my chair, my vision blurring. How many secrets had Henry been hiding? When Carolyn arrived, I had already gone through most of the files. Her face darkened as she reviewed them. She said $20 million was an astronomical sum in those days, and that Henry could not have acted alone. She pointed to a signature and said the approval belonged to Director Collins, now head of the city's banking commission. I gasped. This went far deeper than I had imagined. I told Carolyn I needed to go to Hillcrest Cemetery immediately. That afternoon, she drove me there. East Section, Row 4, Plot 17. A simple black granite headstone read, Henry Vance, beloved father. There was no mention of him as a husband. I knelt, tracing the cold stone, whispering his name and demanding an explanation. The wind moved through the pines like a reply. I took out the Robert Frost book we both loved and Read the Road Not Taken. We had promised to read it at each other's grave. I told Henry he had lied for decades, and yet I still couldn't hate him. As the sun set, I stood up and made a decision. I told Carolyn to contact the media. I would reveal everything. In the days before the press conference, Carolyn, Clara, and I gathered all evidence, the forged records, missing funds, and threats from Vanessa and Ryan. Carolyn asked if I was sure. I said calmly I wasn't exposing Henry, only the crimes of Vanessa and Ryan. At the press conference, the room was full. I stood at the podium and detailed decades of fraud and slander. When evidence showed where the $20 million went, gasps filled the room. Director Collins's name appeared clearly. I clarified the final lie. Clara Vance was Henry's daughter, but not mine. Clara showed her DNA report. Cameras flashed. Afterward, Director Collins was detained. Vanessa and Ryan vanished. Warrants were issued. That night, Ryan appeared at my door, broken and desperate. He knelt, begging forgiveness. I told him not to call me mother. The moment he threatened me, we stopped being family. I closed the door His cries faded. A month later, justice was served. Vanessa was sentenced to 15 years. Ryan received probation. Director Collins was prosecuted. Most funds were recovered. Clara quit her job and moved to another city. She came to say goodbye, apologizing for her father and herself. I finally told her to visit Henry sometimes at Hillcrest. She asked if I hated him. I looked at the sunset and said love and hate were never simple. The community college reinstated my classes, and Oakwood Elementary rehired me as a consultant. Life slowly returned to normal. Carolyn helped reorganize my finances. Ryan repaid part of the trust fund, with the rest scheduled. My retirement was secure. One evening, Carolyn teased me about meeting Professor Harris, a widower from the college. I didn't refuse. At my age, perhaps life was just beginning. That weekend, I went alone to Pine Ridge Memorial Park. As the sun set, the forest glowed gold. I spoke to Henry in my heart, telling him I forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because I needed to let go. At home, I read The Road Not Taken Again. This time, there were no tears. Tomorrow, I would place white chrysanthemums on Henry's grave, not as a wife, but as an old friend. Then, I would attend Carolyn's dinner and meet Professor Harris. I was 68 years old, and there were still many good days ahead of me.